everybody, this is Ann and welcome back to Painting Big. Today we are going to tackle some bigger plates, a breastplate actually, on a Dark Sword Corgi Paladin. So let's get to it. Alright, this is our little guy. I painted this guy for so many demos, but he's got a nice big like plain breastplate, and so I really like to use him. So today we're going to be doing something a little bit different and using bronze. My base color for bronze tends to be something like this. This is actually an NMM Gold Shadow, but this particular type of kind of greenish, brownish, yellowish color works really well for a base for bronze, as you can see on the Corgi. I've also been known to use things like using rich leather, but putting a little bit of blackened brown into it, and then you get roughly the same color. And then there's also Uniform Brown 9127, which is a little bit lighter, a little bit more golden colored. That's an MSP core color. All right. So I've already got this base kind of blocked in, and the first thing that we're going to do is talk about the fact that this is a rounded breastplate, right? It's very, very like barrel shaped. And so the light, when it falls on it, it's going to make a more round highlight. And since we've got this ridge going down the middle, we're going to get kind of a rounded oblong highlight on each side. A little bit narrower on this side because of this hand getting in the way. So there's casting a shadow right there. So with that in mind, let's block in a highlight first this time. So I'm using rich leather, which I just talked about, with 1 drop of white in it, to create this kind of golden color, kind of golden orangish almost. And then I've also taken that over and added more white to get a highlight for that. And then this is brown liner for my shadow. So I'm going to kind of block in a light oval shaped area. And again, I'm going to be thinking about where does the surface kind of, reflect perpendicular to my eyes, and where does it start to curve away from my eyes, right? Like obviously here it's kind of curving away. And then also when it starts to drop down here, it's going to curve down and the light is going to be lost, right? It's not really going to hit like beyond this point. So I'm going to focus my highlights in this area, and this is just the first highlight. So you can see that's starting to come up. I could start with something more dramatic, but then it wouldn't blend as easily. So on this other side. And yeah, he's got those little nicks in his breastplate too. We can talk about those also when we get there. So I'm going to do a little bit of highlight over here. Kind of going to stop around there. And then the center part is also going to have a highlight. That's going to stop right around there. So we can either go on with a higher highlight now, or we can do a shadow. So let's do the highlight first this time. We seldom do that. If you wanted this to be more brass or gold, by the way, you would essentially add much more yellow in these highlights. Gold especially. Brass still has some greenness, some coldness to it, although it also would go more yellow than this. So I'm going to just kind of put a smaller highlight within that oval that I did. And I can take my previous highlight to kind of blend in that color. There's quite a big difference between these two highlights, and so a little bit of wet blending may be in order. And then on this side, it's going to be more toward the middle. This is assuming an overhead light source. And again, I might want to keep it more toward the center here. And I'll bring this up more as well. Not quite yet, though. All right, so let's put in shadows. Get a little closer. You already can see I've got actually a little bit of greenish shadow in the middle. I'm going to use my brown liner to kind of create about where it starts to kind of go away from the eye. kind of a rounded shadow. Because this is such, like, technically it's almost round, right? This big, like, central armor piece. So you're going to get a very rounded feel from the shadows. The shadows are what are defining your mass and the shape and the solidity. So I'm going to mix a little bit of my base color into here to make it a little bit less extreme. You can definitely see I didn't thin my brown liner a lot there. So I'm painting over it with my base color to kind of knock that out a little bit. Blend it in a little bit better. But that's roughly the location of that shadow. And then the other side will kind of mirror it, though this time we'll mix a little bit of our base coat into our brown liner from the beginning. And we're not going to have a lot of room over there to show any reflected light. This side, though, we can. So, rounded highlight. And if you look kind of, it's rounded even if you combine these two, although we need to take our highlight down a little bit more, don't we? Maybe right around there. Maybe even a little, it feels like a little bit too much to take it too low. But I need to put that shadow also over this area. And I want to keep that shadow the same kind of level as these shadows are meeting. I can take my brown liner also and kind of accentuate this ridge in the center as what I want to. If I want to. So by bringing a little bit of lining down on either side, I can accentuate that there and bring in a bit of shadow. That'll make that ridge stand out more. Okay, now let's do a little bit of reflected light and then we'll really get doubling down on our main highlight. So reflected light is going to be coming in here from light that's coming down and reflecting off of the gauntlet and off of the sword and off of everything. So we're going to go back to our first highlight, that rich leather with white. Now we're going to start to kind of bring in a highlight on the side so that we can see that there is light reflecting over here. And I don't want to make this as bright as my main highlight, but I will mix a little bit of my top highlight into this color and bring that in. Just a little bit there. And again, these highlights are going to be curved, right? They're going to follow the shape of the thing, like so. Now let's really get a white highlight in there, because until we get that pure white in there, it's not going to look really like metal. And we also need to use that white to highlight around those dents. After we finish this part, I'm going to quick show you another example of a different sort of breastplate. I'm going to throw some water into this white. Pure white is what I use. Now the top highlight is really going to be right where these dents are, so we may as well use that. When you've got light falling from above, it's not necessarily going to hit the top edge as much, but it will definitely hit the bottom edge and highlight the edge of any indentation. So we can put a white streak there. We want to keep that line as fine as we can. Same over here. And technically we could also bring in a little bit of that down here, or use our next highlight down, because this is almost in shadow, but it would still probably bring out a little bit of light. So we can pick that out. So I mixed white with my next lowest highlight. There we go. So it's not quite as high as up here. We can definitely we want to bring in more white than this. I'm going to thin it more if I'm going to get a decent layer on it, but I can use the stronger puddle of white I have here to get a light right down here. Right on the same level as those patches. And I can thin a little bit and put that, make it go up a little bit more. Now let's take our really thin white and kind of bring in an additional highlight right at the center of our previous one. That's going to be right around this area. And then over here, it's going to be right around there. So as we bring up that white, we start to look more like, got some, we can bring in our also a reflected light down here. But if we're going to do that, then we need to bring in a little reflected light on either side. So let's just block some in there. It's a little hard down here because of the way that our shadow is. We could work on that if we wanted to. Essentially work it off of this just to bring it up a little bit. There, see it? So then that's starting to really look alive when we bring in that, and we've got that highlight going around, we've got that highlight right there. Got our shadow. The shadows are all lining up, the highlights are lining up. And that is, we could even bring this up a little bit more, this highlight out here. And we could probably blend it in a little bit better. But I can bring this up a bit more if I want toward the top, bring it stronger. I can narrow down that shadow a bit. Probably on the outside. And blend in that highlight. So I want my shadow maybe to go a little bit more narrow. See it? Yeah. So how much you want to keep is up to you. How, you know, we kind of use your gut. But that's how I would go around about that. Now, in the few minutes we have left, let's look at this orc. He's obviously steel. His big plate is overlapping. It's got features on it, and it's also angled. If you look, the bottom one isn't. The bottom one's rounded, but this top one is slightly angled. You could do this either way. If there's a true angle down the middle, then the white line helps to define that, and then you end up doing what you do with the spear blade. Remember, where you have to pick essentially an angle the light is coming from, an angle for this to be stronger. So in my case, since his face is pointing this way, I've chosen to make this side the lighter side and this side the darker side. So I would put a darker shadow in here. I don't have my grays mixed up, so I'm just using the brown liner to kind of show you guys. I have a line between these plates. Down here we've got all these like little projections, and so I'm gonna be making the underside of those pretty dark. So these little projections, I kind of paint each of them like their own little NMM island. So I'll take my white and I'll angle, I'll get all the white edging down on the bigger ones. If I have a side part, I can put in a tiny bit of under reflection on the downside of this. I can put in a tiny bit of shadow at the top. It's harder to do this with these small models, but you can make it work. And they end up looking okay. Just kind of like fudge it according to what seems right to you. But mostly I'm going to talk about where when you've got an angle, you want to define that angle, and then you want to kind of choose where you're going. Since this is also rounded, that's why I don't have immediately a dark shadow like right under this top edge. I could bring in a shadow, and I kind of look at it and say, okay, right around here I think is where that angle starts to kind of dip away from the light. You got to look at that plate, and where it's mostly facing up, you really aren't going to get a shadow, but if it dips down enough, you could probably work a shadow into right here. And if you've got that, you're not going to get an under reflection necessarily for reflected light on this plate, right? You definitely get some bounce light over here, since you've chosen this side to kind of be your shadow. Since you've chosen a slight bias toward this angle, we can reflected light over here. And just highlight more out toward this side, away from the shadow. See that? And then here, obviously I've edged the top because this plate curves back directly downward. So I would grab a dark shadow and I'd put that right under that edge, right? The darker I make that, the more shiny it can look. We've got more dents over here, but I don't probably have time to talk about them. You do them the same way we did on the Corgi. This bottom plate comes out again, projects out, so we've got really a dark shadow here. Now this is where we have to remember that we might have a shadow here, but this little edge that's catching light is going to be bouncing light back up to the underside of this plate. So if I put a line there, I can grab my white and I can highlight just a little bit down on that underside. I want most of this to be dark, but I want to keep a little light down here. So let's try to just kind of fudge that in super fast. It's like I might have that and that. And I'm gonna have to blend that. But we gotta have that dark shadow up top. And that's gonna kind of go around these little spikes. The spikes are gonna catch the light because they're sticking out. So you can see that when you're painting something, a more complex plate like this, you can kind of like have a lot to think about, right? So maybe I shade that a lot. And then I have to bring it up a little bit. Get a little bit more of a gradient in there. Yeah. But anyway, there are lots of times where I have to go back and forth and kind of question and look at what I've done and ask myself if it's working or if I'm missing something. And sometimes I just have to kind of paint it over a couple times and see, okay, what really looks good. It depends on the shape and the scale. So doubling down on that dark, I probably went a little bit too dark. Because most of the time when you're dealing with metal, the dark is just going to be a little like a narrow shadow, and it's not going to be super wide because metal is going to reflect a lot of light from the environment. So when I minimize that, it looks a little bit more right. And sometimes I have to remind myself of that when I'm like, oh, but it's pointed down. And then I'm like, yeah, but light is bouncing up from the ground at it. So anyway, that's just kind of like, I just wanted to touch on this. These are more complex shapes. I would shade under all these little bumps because they're blocking the light. Right, so those are going to start to look like their own little kind of islands. And so on. It's starting to look a little bit more correct. And of course, the problem is here too that, you know, my lights are making this look darker than it actually is painted. And this is where it gets difficult, right? When the light in the environment around the figure doesn't help you when you're trying to pick up light from certain angles, it might look incorrect, even though you've painted it right. It's a little better. That's starting to pick up a little bit of a shine reflecting from the bottom now, and that feels better. So that's kind of along the lines of what I would do there. Okay, folks, there you are. A couple of examples of like bigger breastplate type areas. This one, of course, very, very sketchy. The other more actually constrained. The other thing I might do with these little dents, depending, these are pretty dark already, but you could also just take your liner and line those little guys. If they seem like they're not dark enough, you can line them or use a little bit of thinned liner just to make them stand out a little bit. I think they stand out enough, so I don't know that I would do real strong lining on all of them. But especially for these little dark guys down here, the guys are down below, a little bit of brown line in the scratch itself can help to bring out details. There we go. Okay, next month, we're going to be dealing with shields. I've got a couple of different examples of shields that I can show you kind of how I would do the metal on each of them. And then that should kind of conclude our NMM series for the YouTube. I'd like to switch over and do some basing stuff and then come back to conceptual techniques after that and do some source lighting stuff. All right? So let's look forward to that, hopefully. Thanks very much for tuning in, and this is Anne signing off.